Well, Trump is looking to bypass Congress. Now, the White House is developing a plan that would effectively cut taxes on capital gains by changing the way that they're calculated. This is all according to a report by Bloomberg. Now, here's how it will work. Profits on investments will be indexed to inflation, and the Trump administration may try and bypass Congress in order to do this. Now, joining us now is Grover Norquist. He's president of the Americans for Tax Reform, and Maddie Duppler, a senior fellow at the National Taxpayers Union. And Grover, let me start with you. We've seen President Trump's administration is not the first administration to try and do this or talk about doing this. Going back to 1992, we saw George H.W. Bush try and do a similar thing. Do you think that this has a better chance of passing or actually taking effect this time around?
Yes, because since Bush looked at it and a bureaucrat told him, oh, we're not sure you can do this, they didn't ever try to do it. They just asked a bureaucrat if they could, and they said, we don't know. There was a Supreme Court decision in 2002 that said the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, could do exactly this for their assessment of the cost of something, not historic cost, but cost plus inflation, what something was purchased in real terms. And so doing the same thing for your home, land, stock you own, for corporations than companies own. If you've owned something for 30, 40, 50 years, there's more inflation than real gain when you sell that in capital gains. It would be tremendously helpful to the economy. Supreme Court's made it clear it's completely bulletproof in terms of the law, and it has a lot of support in the House, the Senate, and in the administration.
Maddie, do you think that this will likely face some legal challenges here?
Well, back in the 90s, the National Taxpayers Union Foundation side, so my organization, the research arm, published a memo saying just what Grover just said, which is that the Treasury has the ability to define costs in a way that it will allow you to exclude inflation from calculating the cost of the value of an asset. So I think that if Treasury were to move forward with this, sure, there may be challenges. But remember, in our legal system, you need to have standing in order to challenge something like this. So it's hard to see who exactly would be harmed if this policy decision were to go into effect. Grover just mentioned a couple of things that I think are important. This is not just a policy change that would affect investors and stockholders, which, of course, there are many millions of Americans across this country who are stockholders, but people who own homes, people who are collectors who want to try and sell items that they've bought with years and years of value built into those. All of those sorts of assets, they grow in value over time, and we should stop penalizing savers for that passage of time and index capital gains to inflation as a result.
You know, the argument that you both are making, that it's not just going to help the wealthy, but it is interesting when you take a look at some of the studies that have been out recently. There's estimates in 2018 by the Penn Wharton budget model that said that the top 1% would receive approximately 86% of the benefit of this. Grover, what do you have to say to that?
Well, since half of Americans own shares of stock, half of Americans own homes, every farmer would benefit from this. The answer is anybody, and this is available to anybody, by the way, anybody who owns an asset, buys an asset, has an asset, would no longer be penalized for the taxation on inflation. Schumer, the lead Democrat in the Senate, was on the floor of the Senate on TV saying we ought not to tax inflation on capital gains. He has stated support for this as well. Not necessarily for the executive order, but he says he's for the policy. We'll see if he continues that or whether he wants to play partisan politics. I think that'd be a big mistake. The people who benefit from this are people over 55 who have the most inflation inside their homes, land, any buildings, and you'd see a tremendous unlocking of corporate assets also, because companies live for a long time. They've had assets for 100 years. They don't sell things that are 100 years old because of the high tax on the inflation. This would liberalize and open up maybe $7 trillion over the next 2 years in asset sales from companies. That would be a tremendous boon to the economy, and everybody who gets a job, none of whom are in the top 1%, is the beneficiary of a strong economy.
Maddie, how big of a boost do you see this having on the U.S. economy?
Well, I think there's an important aspect of this that we can't underline enough here, which is what Grover just mentioned, that older Americans are the ones who will benefit the most. And what I think is an interesting public policy question is how then unleashing a lot of the value that they're sitting on, whether it's on dividends coming out of their stock portfolios or out of their homes, would allow for them to not be subject to the pressures that are currently weighing down on a lot of our institutions that take care of older Americans. This is, of course, a demographic problem that we're facing, not just with Social Security, but what we're going to do with housing stock when we've got all these boomers who are trying to get out of their homes. If we were able to unleash the value in all of those kind of dead assets right now, I think that could really go a long way to make an effect on those other public policy questions that are really burning a hole in the back of fiscal policymakers' minds. I think that this could be a really positive policy move in that respect.
Grover, just let's talk about the timing of this. President Trump facing re-election in 2020. How important is it, do you think, for his base in order to get this passed before the 2020 election?
Well, I think if it's done in the next several months, which is very possible, that you will see such a boom in the economy and the stock market and the growth in the economy that it will be, in addition to the tax cut and the deregulation, and hopefully the settling of trade fuffle, tremendously helpful in strengthening the economy going into 2020.
All right, Grover Norquist and Maddie Doppler, thanks so much for joining me today.